Okay, so we're going to jump right in to the study, and I think you're going to find some of the findings pretty surprising.
Yeah, I'm really excited to dig into this one with you.
Yeah, me too. And as is always the case, for anyone listening, we will, of course, link to the actual study and everything in the show notes, so you can always go check it out yourself if you want to read along with us. But anyway, so this one is from way back 1979, and it was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. And they did not mess around with the title here. The title's pretty straightforward.
Oh, yeah.
It is Gender and Cycle Day of Conception, Influence on Different Days of Sexual Intercourse. So they're just getting right to it.
Right to the point.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that really struck me reading through this was they talk about how, the average time between when the last, active intercourse occurred and when ovulation happened was about 2 days. But the range of that timing was
Oh,
huge.
wow. So it wasn't always just like clockwork. 2 days before that, there was a lot of variation.
Yeah, huge variation, which is interesting. So that was like one of my first like, oh, okay, this is more complicated than I thought.
Yeah, it's not as simple as, one might think.
No, no, definitely not. And so this study is really about trying to understand, does the timing of when people have sex during a woman's cycle have any connection to whether they conceive a boy or a girl?
Oh, that's the age-old question, right?
It is. It is. And that's what we're going to dive into today is like, does the when matter for the what, like in terms of a child's sex? Um, and they did this in a really interesting way. I think what makes this study kind of stand out is how they went about it. They looked at over 8,000 births to Orthodox Jewish women living in Jerusalem.
Okay.
And this is important because this community observes some specific practices around menstruation and sex.
Okay.
So there's this period called niddah where intercourse is avoided from the start of menstruation until 7 days after, and then there's this ritual immersion called mikveh that signals the resumption of intercourse.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, so let's unpack that a little because that's really what's key to this whole study design.
Yeah, how does that play into it?
Yeah, so basically because of this religious observance, it creates a situation where the timing of when intercourse restarts in the cycle is more predictable
Yeah.
within this group. So the researchers used the day of this ritual immersion, the mikveh,
Yeah.
as a marker to kind of estimate where a woman was in her cycle relative to when she was likely to ovulate.
Ah, okay. So instead of trying to pinpoint exactly when ovulation is occurring for each individual woman, which we all know is a very inexact science,
Right.
we're
Wrong.
using this event, the ritual,
Yeah.
as kind of a proxy for the timing.
Exactly. Exactly. So instead of having to track ovulation for thousands of women individually, they're like, okay, we know this religiously defined point is happening and we can kind of work backwards from there.
Yeah.
And then what they did was they collected data on, when was the last time intercourse occurred before conception, and then crucially, the sex of the baby. So it's like you can almost picture it, right? Like these windows of opportunity are kind of opening up tied to this religious practice.
Yeah, and it's fascinating too because it's almost like a natural experiment is being conducted just by virtue of this cultural practice that allows the researchers to study this question,
Yeah.
about biology, in a large population.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really interesting aspect to highlight for the learner, just the way that this study is set up.
Right. And, it kind of gets around some of the typical challenges of studying this kind of stuff where it's like, well, we don't know exactly when everybody's ovulating. But in this case, they're like, okay, well, we know this event happened, so we can kind of backtrack from there.
Exactly. Yeah, it makes it a lot cleaner.
Yeah. So what did they find with this really interesting setup? First off, they just looked at the overall sex ratio in this group. So across those, over 8,000 births, they saw 51.9% male births and 48.1% female births.
Okay, so just slightly more males.
Yeah, which is kind of what we often see in, just general populations too. So it's kind of setting the stage. But then here's where it gets interesting is they started to look at how that male to female ratio changed depending on when intercourse resumed after that period of, abstaining.
Okay.
So they break it down based on how many days after the last menstruation did intercourse occur. And the real story kind of unfolds there because what jumps out is a clear trend conceptions that happened earlier in the cycle. So for example, if intercourse resumed around 2 days before they expected ovulation,
Okay.
or like even on the day of or the day after that estimated ovulation,
Okay.
they saw a noticeably higher proportion of male births.
Ah, so the earlier, the more likely to be male.
Yeah, and to give you some numbers to put that in perspective, like what their data showed was actually pretty significant.
Okay.
For instance, if intercourse resumed just 2 days before the expected day of ovulation, 65.5% of the births were male.
Wow. Okay. So that's like almost two-thirds chance just from that slight difference in timing.
Yeah, so it really makes you think, right? Like, oh, it's not necessarily a 50-50 coin flip,
It's not just totally random.
Yeah, it's a much bigger shift than you might expect. And they visualize this too in their findings where it's like, the likelihood of having a boy seems to be higher when intercourse is happening earlier in the cycle, further away from the estimated time of ovulation.
So as you get closer to ovulation, the chance of a boy goes down.
Yeah, it seems like it. Yeah, and this is important too because they point out that this pattern held true regardless of whether a woman had a very regular menstrual cycle or a more irregular one.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so it wasn't like this was only happening in people who are super predictable.
Yeah, so it seems like it wasn't just a fluke of the regular cycles.
Right, right. It was like, okay, there's something else going on here. And that's really, the million-dollar question, right? Like why, what do the researchers think might be behind this? What's the biological explanation for why we're seeing this pattern? And they discuss a couple different things.
Okay, yeah, I'm curious to hear their thoughts.
So one of the main ideas that they consider is the possibility that sperm carrying the X chromosome, which would, result in a female, and sperm carrying the Y chromosome, which results in a male, might have different survival rates within the woman's reproductive tract.
Okay.
And in that survival can be affected by, the timing in the menstrual cycle.
So it's not just that one type of sperm is faster at getting to the egg, but maybe one is more likely to still be around when the egg shows up.
Exactly. Yeah, it's not necessarily a speed race. It's like a who can hang out the longest kind of thing.
Battle of attrition.
Yeah, exactly. And they specifically point out that cervical mucus, which of course, plays a huge role in helping sperm travel to the egg, actually changes its consistency and chemical makeup throughout the cycle.
Right.
And earlier in the cycle, the mucus tends to be thicker and more acidic. And they're like, well, maybe this environment is actually more favorable to the Y chromosome bearing sperm.
So it's almost like they're tougher.
Yeah, they're like the marathon runners. They're like, we can handle this acidic environment. We can hang out here for a while.
They can wait it out until ovulation?
Exactly. And then as you get closer to ovulation, the mucus becomes thinner and more alkaline. So it's kind of a more hospitable environment for everybody.
Okay.
But they're speculating that maybe in this kind of more welcoming environment, closer to ovulation, the X chromosome bearing sperm, which might, have different characteristics, might then have a better chance of survival and fertilization.
Interesting. So it's like the changing environment throughout the cycle is kind of selecting for different types of sperm at different times.
Yeah, it's almost like it's acting as a filter, right? Like depending on when intercourse is happening, it's kind of tipping the scales one way or the other.
Right, kind of subtly influencing the odds.
Yeah, exactly. Now, of course, this is a really interesting theory, but one thing we have to remember is the specific group of people that were studied in this case.
Right. This wasn't just a random sample of the general population.
No, this was Orthodox Jewish women in Jerusalem who, because of their religious practices, have these more defined periods of abstinence and resumption of intercourse.
Right.
So we can't necessarily assume that these exact findings would perfectly apply to other populations with different patterns,
Right, where there isn't that same rhythm of intercourse.
Right, right. And that's, always something to keep in mind with any research. And also it's important to remember that this study shows us a correlation. It's like, okay, there's this link between the timing of intercourse and the sex ratio in this group.
Yeah.
But it doesn't definitively prove that the timing causes the difference.
Right. There could be other factors at play that they weren't able to account for in this study.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, I think it's really interesting to think about, why does this research matter? Like, why should somebody listening to us care?
Yeah.
What does it kind of add to our understanding of, how humans reproduce?
Well, I think it provides some valuable insights into kind of the subtle interplay of biological factors that are happening at the very earliest stages of life.
Right.
And it highlights how, the timing of events within the reproductive system can have a real impact on outcomes we often think of as totally random.
Right, right.
It adds to our knowledge about how sperm behave, the dynamic role of cervical mucus, this window of opportunity for fertilization. And I think
Yeah.
that's all really interesting.
And it makes you think about some of those, old wives' tales or folk wisdom about like, oh, if you want to conceive a boy or a girl, you should do this or that,
Yeah.
It's like the study's kind of like, okay, maybe there's a little bit of biological truth to some of these ideas, even if the advice itself isn't necessarily, spot on.
Yeah, it lends some potential scientific backing to some of those long-held beliefs.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I think let's kind of sum up for the learner here. What are the key things we should take away from this deep dive into this study from, way back when, but still really interesting?
Yeah, so the main takeaway is this, the population of Orthodox Jewish women studied, there was a clear association between the timing of intercourse within the menstrual cycle and the sex of the baby.
Okay.
Intercourse occurring earlier in the cycle relative to the estimated time of ovulation was linked to a higher chance of conceiving a male child, while intercourse happening later in the cycle showed a trend towards a higher chance of conceiving a female child.
Yeah.
And it's important to note, this pattern held true for women with both regular and irregular cycles.
So, you know, the learner, what this means for you is it kind of gives us a more nuanced understanding of this really fundamental aspect of human life, how we create life.
Yeah.
It moves beyond, the simple idea of like sperm meets egg. And it's like, okay, well, maybe the timing of that meeting,
Right.
influenced by events earlier in the cycle, might actually play a role in determining the sex of the baby. So it's that moment where science can kind of shed some light on something that often feels completely random.
Exactly. And it really underscores how intricate and dynamic human reproduction is, and how these seemingly subtle biological factors can have observable effects on, these really important outcomes.
So, okay, one last thought for the learner, something to ponder. We've been talking about this in the context of this one specific study.
Right.
But zoom out for a second and think about, the complexity of human reproduction globally,
Right.
with all sorts of cultural practices around the world, different norms, behaviors, and then layer on top of that these biological tendencies that we've been discussing.
Yeah.
Maybe we don't always consciously act on them, but they're there.
Right.
So how might those two things, those cultural practices and those biological realities, intersect and maybe even shape in small or large ways the broader patterns that we see of family structures or demographics?
Oh, that is an interesting question.
Right. It's a really interesting thing to think about. Like, what are those hidden influences that are kind of shaping the world around us?
Yeah. The unseen forces at play.
Exactly.
I like that.
Yeah. It's a lot to ponder, but I think it's really fascinating.
Definitely a lot to think about there.
Yeah, for sure. So, yeah, that's our deep dive for today. Hope you enjoyed it.
Yeah, this is a good one.
Always fun to chat with you.
Likewise.
All right. Until next time.